Jonathan Ortmans, here to my right, is the president of Global Entrepreneurship Week and a senior fellow at the Kauffman Foundation. Through Jonathan's leadership, Global Entrepreneurship Week has built a network of over 25,000 organizations in more than 120 countries that are all working to build the next generation of global entrepreneurs. Jonathan is an immigrant entrepreneur himself and has 2 startups and exits under his belt, one here in the States and one overseas. Our first panelist, Neil Ruiz, is an associate fellow and senior policy analyst at the Brookings Institution's Metropolitan Policy Program, where his research focuses on international migration, innovation, and economic development. He has published several highly impactful reports, including a recent one for Brookings titled "The Search for Skills: Demand for H1B Immigrant Workers in U.S. Metropolitan Areas." Our second panelist, Ted Alden, is the Bernard L. Schwartz Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, and he's also the director of the Council on Foreign Relations Renewing America publication series. He formerly was the Washington bureau chief for the Financial Times, and his work focuses on U.S. economic competitiveness and U.S. immigration and visa policy. Our final panelist, Stephan Raes, is the economic minister at the Royal Netherlands Embassy here in Washington. He previously served at the Netherlands Ministry of Economic Affairs as the acting director of strategy, research, and international affairs at the Directorate General for Entrepreneurship and Innovation, where he was responsible for international innovation policy. He's also published several works on immigrant entrepreneurship and policy. I will turn it over to Jonathan now. We'll have a conversation for about 45 minutes or an hour, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. So enjoy.
Thank you very much indeed, Andrew, and thank you so much to America Broad Media for the wonderful work you do at helping tell the story of what's happening, not just in the entrepreneurship space, but in the lives of so many of a new generation of people around the world looking to grapple with the results of what's democratization and the fact that globalization has meant there are exciting new opportunities and issues that we should be tackling in a global way. So we really appreciate your invitation to us to join you today, and welcome everybody. We're going to begin this discussion, I think, first of all, by taking a look at some of the challenges that this discussion of high-skilled immigration is trying to address. We know that immigrants start companies at a higher rate than native-born Americans, and we know that we have often circumstances where those high-growth firms have been particularly benefited particularly from immigrants to the United States. So we know that we'd like to have more high-skilled immigrants, yet we face a system which has all sorts of weaknesses. And I hope maybe we could begin today by asking Neil, if you could start off by telling us what are some of the challenges that you think we're trying to address, apart from the fact that we perhaps all agree that we should have some more high-skilled immigrants into the United States. Why are we having so much trouble doing that?
Well, in part, it has a lot to do with our immigration system now. It's actually quite complicated. The main kind of avenue right now for high-skilled immigrants to come in the United States is through the highly controversial kind of H1B Visa program. And this visa currently is I guess you would call it catch-all visa program. It captures immigrants who are here really, truly temporary. A lot of IT consulting firms that hire people here for 3 years or leave after a few years. Then you have companies that use the H1B visa for, they apply for a green card and an H1B at the same time because there is no avenue for them to, they can't apply for a green card straight away. And then you also have other entrepreneurs who are starting up their business also applying for the H1B, but then there's requirements of prevailing wage, and they have a struggle if I'm an equity stake in my company, I'm not being paid by wages. How does that translate? So all of these various different types of, this one visa is capturing many different types of purposes. And I think the challenge is how to sparse that out. And I think that's what the challenges that Washington has right now.
Okay. So, Ted, maybe you could tell us a little bit more about these visas. Why are we having so much difficulty expanding the number of visas made available to people? So why is it such a crowded field?
Well, let me, if I could just back up for a second and just frame it slightly larger. I mean, I think the story, if you go back several decades, is the United States has always been incredibly successful at attracting talented immigrants, and this is a country where people want to come. It's generally easier to start a business here than it is in most places. It's easier to reap the rewards of your business if you're successful. It's a country that's been friendly and welcoming to immigrants over its history. And so lately, in part as a result of the excellent work that people at Kauffman and others have done, we've begun as a country to recognize the tremendous value that these immigrants have brought. Our universities, of course, are an enormous magnet. If you're the best at what you do in the world, you might think about going to Cambridge or Oxford, but if you're not going to go there, you're going to go to Harvard, or you're going to go to Yale, you're going to go to Stanford. So the U.S. is this incredible magnet. What's happened in more recent years, I think, is two things. One, there are a lot more opportunities in the big sending countries, in the Chinas and in the Indias. So there's more of a competition for keeping these people here because they have opportunities back home. I think a second thing is that other countries have caught on to this. So the Europeans, the Canadians, the Australians, and others have realized that there is this kind of golden goose in the United States, and they want a piece of it. So they've done more to try to attract these immigrant entrepreneurs. And then I think the final thing, which the visa topic addresses, is that our system is really cumbersome. It was always pretty bad, got worse after 9/11 because of various reviews that made it hard for people to come in. But our system has never particularly been designed to try to identify and keep highly skilled people. We still live under rules that were put in place 50 years ago, and they were largely about bringing families together. And that was the focus at the time. The issue was really integrating new immigrants into American society. We didn't really think about immigration at that time as a tool of economic competition. And so now we are, but we're burdened with this system that doesn't meet that need very well, and for lots of political reasons that all of us are familiar with, it's very hard to change that system through Congress.
Well, let's if we can narrow down to that perspective around new immigrants and new firms. I think one of the common data points of the Kauffman Foundation has been part of trying to pull out of the Census Bureau is that almost all net new jobs over the past 25 years or so have come from firms less than 5 years old, and that therefore there's a unique value to the economy of new and young firms. What's the argument against us allowing more people who aren't born in the United States to start firms here? Is it that, obviously, if we've got Canada with a startup visa program, we've got countries like Australia that actually have a funded program to recruit people to come, and we'll come to see what's happening in the Netherlands in a minute. But why is it that it seems to common sense that if you let people come to the great universities, as you've talked about, and if they wish to start a bioscience firm, that actually, I guess, if they're here on the wrong visa, technically they could get put in jail. So why is it we're having we have this difficulty? What's the argument against us opening the doors to allow that to happen?
I don't think the arguments against it are very good. I think there are lots of strong arguments in favor, and I think if you look in Congress right now, there's pretty strong bipartisan support for some kind of entrepreneur's visa. I mean, the difficulty has been that it's tied up with the larger immigration reform challenge, which is a big one for lots of reasons. I do think there are real issues, though, if you actually get into the design of these programs, because the thing about a country like the United States or any advanced country is that the demand for people who want to immigrate to the United States is always going to exceed our willingness as a country to admit them. And so we come up with criteria. We have quotas. We try to enforce those criteria. So if you have a blanket rule that says anybody who comes to the United States and wants to start a company can stay, well, how do you decide what that means? What does it mean to start a company, right? If I start drawing T-shirts in my bedroom and selling those, have I started a company? And is that someone we want to keep? And so the selection criteria become very complicated because we'd all agree, if you're Jerry Yang and you're going to set up the next Yahoo, yeah, we want you here. But if you're going to be designing T-shirts in your bedroom and selling them on the street corner, maybe that's not someone that we would pick out from a selection system. So that's, I think, why it's so hard. It's very difficult to establish sensible criteria that let in the people you want and exclude people who candidly are not going to bring the sort of economic value
Yeah.
that
And I
looking
guess
for.
what you're saying is, and Neil, maybe you can comment on this, you have to work out what you're trying to achieve. So maybe if it's job creation, why isn't a startup visa, for example, tied to your ability over a period of time to actually create jobs, rather than necessarily your ability to raise capital, which, have you delved into some of these complexities?
Yeah, I looked at, the current Senate bill actually has Invest Visa that they actually approved, that they're going to be voting on. And that would, they set up requirements. If you raise a certain amount of capital, like $100,000 over 3 years, and create 3 jobs, then you could continue on this kind of visa. And then they also have an immigrant visa version of it where they could stay here permanently if you got $750,000 and created like a lot more jobs, 5+ jobs. But the question here, though, that the challenge here still, I think, is we know that startups still have a very high failure rate. We want the startups here, but sometimes startup companies, entrepreneurs fail at their first venture, and then they usually fail a couple of times, and then they succeed, and they have that big one, maybe the 3rd or 4th time. So the challenge for a visa system is what do you do if you fail the first one? Do you get kicked out, or what if you, and then you go back to your country and you succeed in the 2nd or 3rd? That's kind of the challenge here.
Yeah. Stephan, maybe I could turn to you. So to what degree is it true or false that maybe foreign countries are benefiting from the fact that we're grappling with the complexities of developing a more sensible and, shall I say, efficient immigration system?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Of course, I think first and foremost, many European countries, including the Netherlands, look with admiration at this magnet that the United States still is for worldwide talent. Without further policy competition, I think that is still probably the most important perspective in the Netherlands. And I think that we also look at it in a way that not just immigrant entrepreneurship is important, but emigrant entrepreneurship is as well. The essence in what we talk about here is not about shortages and things like that. It's about international linkages and how these are tremendously important for productivity and innovation. So the first thing that we probably noticed from the Netherlands in looking at what's happening in the United States is looking at the difficulties that Dutch startups encounter here in the United States. I get, and more so than my predecessor, since, as we all know, economic conditions in Europe are perhaps not as brightly as they were a couple of years ago. There's plenty of Dutch startups wanting to try their luck in the United States, and they sometimes don't get any further because of restrictions on the visa side. And I think that is a real loss for the United States, but also for us, because I believe these Dutch women and men not just will contribute to economic development here, but also in the Netherlands. So that is, I think, one perspective. The second one is indeed that all countries, of course, given globalization, have to make sure that they are efficient, welcoming, and attractive for investment as well as for people. And the Dutch system, and perhaps we can talk about that differently in a moment, has always been a bit more demand-driven than the supply-side point system that's been used here. You see emerging of systems, I think, at the moment. But one of the advantages of the demand system, of course, was that there's a very close connection to the skills on the market, offered on the market, and the demand side there. We never saw any need for a cap. If there's companies who want these bright women, then they should have it. We've very much sought the solution in how we want to compete, if you want to, in simplification. And I admire legislation here in the United States Congress, but the 800 pages of the bills that are being presented here is quite different than what we had in the Netherlands a couple of weeks ago, which was a couple of pages long, where we basically tried to simplify procedures. No disrespect meant. Of course.
And it's 1,000 pages now. So.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Well, let's look at it from this angle, if we could, because I'm interested in particular in your comment that maybe in an era of globalization where, for example, I think the field of entrepreneurship has been democratized around the world, that maybe what we should be focusing on is our common, the common value proposition on a global basis. I know in a second I want to play a clip where we have someone from India talking about the sort of reverse brain drain concept. But before we do that, let me just address that issue to our other two panelists. Is your sense here that it's not really a winner or a loser in terms of international value? Or am I right in saying that actually all boats rise on an incoming tide, which would be advancing the ability of entrepreneurs on a global basis? I often meet with these startup communities in very odd parts of the world, and I tell them if I put you all in one room, told you to leave your passport at the door, and told you to pick one up on your way out, you would fit right back in wherever it took you. There seems to be this sort of globalization of this startup culture. So am I right in saying that we might want to look at our immigration issues outside of our national legal infrastructures and look at it more saying how do we make all boats rise on an incoming tide? Either Neil or the comment?
I've got a couple comments and maybe Neil. I hope at some point actually that we will become more nuanced in our concept of immigration, because increasingly movement is so easy around the world that people often go back and forth, right? They often have multiple passports. People may come and go to university in the United States, set up a company here, and then realize there's a great opportunity back in their home country to spin off what they've done here in the United States, and so they'll set up a business in their home country. They may live there for a while. There'll be linkages back with a U.S. company. They'll be buying U.S. goods or services because of those linkages. So I think that really is a case where we shouldn't just be thinking about it about, some foreign citizen comes to the United States and they put down roots here and they stay here forever. Mm-hmm. That's increasingly not the way the world works anymore. So I think there is a kind of rising tide phenomenon there. That said, benefits can be bigger and smaller depending on location. So I do think, as a country, and you started off by noting the job creation from startups, as a country we have an interest in trying to encourage as much of that activity to take place on our shores as we can, because a lot of our population is not mobile. They depend on jobs that are created by companies here in the United States. So even though there may be this general benefit, I think there is, that doesn't mean that there isn't a competitive quality in terms of trying to encourage location in the United States.
Okay, good.
Yeah, I agree with Ted. I think that but there's this balance that we're trying to struggle with. I think, in a sense, that a lot of the U.S. immigrants, when they succeed here and then they bring their knowledge, there's a lot of connections and a lot of evidence that you at Kauffman Foundation have published on connections between Silicon Valley, India, and Hsinchu Tech Park in Taiwan, where you have industries being built by immigrant entrepreneurs who go back and forth between the countries. And I think in that way it benefits them around the globe, all of us. But at the same time, we also still have to think about, and this is where we struggle when making national policy, is how to protect American workers and making sure that they have the skills and are not left behind. And because of our broken, not just immigration system, but our educational system, there's a lot of people in the United States that don't have those opportunities. So that's kind of the struggle and the balance that we have to kind of create.
Well, let's turn to Professor Chatterjee, who's mentioned, I think, in the clip.
Professor Avijit Chatterjee heads job placement for the IIT campus in Mumbai. Now, he says, only about 10% of recent graduates move to the U.S. The rest stay and get jobs with multinationals, or increasingly, they become entrepreneurs.
These guys are going to strike out on their own in India as opposed to, say, California or Silicon Valley, which was the trend maybe. So they are looking at India-specific problems, because I think they perceive a lot of untapped opportunities in India.
If a worker under an H1B comes up with an idea that they believe might make a lot of money and they want to spin it off.
So this notion that to some degree, a lot more are going to stay in India, and I think it was last year that we discovered that there were more Indian immigrants that were leaving the United States than were coming into the United States. I just want to turn to Stephan, and once again, if you want to comment on this, is there any concerns at home about whether or not any liberalization of immigration laws in the United States would mean that there would be more of Dutch talent might end up coming to the United States, staying here for good?
I think that again, whatever, trying to give a nuanced answer, there is, of course, on some levels, in some thought leaders, perhaps the idea that, for instance, in research, where there is this tremendous appeal in Massachusetts, in the West Coast, in top universities here in the United States, where Dutch researchers leave because facilities sometimes are better here than at home. Not in all cases. There's fantastic research groups where we're also still very happy that we have our American friends coming that way. But in some cases that happens, and indeed words like brain drain, again, I don't believe in that term as an economist, but is something that people see as a challenge. I'm very glad that the perspective now is perhaps less on stopping that brain drain, but in making it productive. In making sure that when we have somebody with a fantastic professorship in Harvard, a Dutch man or woman, that we make sure that we maintain the context with the Dutch knowledge infrastructure, that is also somebody who helps getting Dutch PhD students here to make sure that they're going to do their thing. So the perspective, again, of course, to some extent is like, we have to be careful not to lose the brightest of the Netherlands to other countries. I mean, of course, that would not be something that's desirable. But in the end, I hope that the perspective is this is something that is part of globalization that we cannot control, and the thing to do is to make sure that we make use of these developments the way that it takes shape.
Great. I want to move on shortly to talk about what's actually in the current immigration legislation, and we can sort of fast track to where we are as of this date. But before we do, can we just talk a little bit about what are the other reasons? I mean, I understand that obviously the number of immigrant entrepreneurs has dropped over the past few years, and I think before we often launch a discussion about what we're going to do to fix the system, maybe we fully understood and collected data about why that's the case. And I thought maybe we might have some comments from the panelists on why has the number of immigrants dropped? Is it just because of visa issues, or is it other issues, or are there other challenges that immigrant entrepreneurs face in establishing a business in the United States? Comments?
I mean, a lot of the Kauffman research, again, is the best out there in this. I mean, generally, there's been a decline in startups in the recovery from this recession compared to others. That's usually a period where you see a lot of startup activity. So clearly there are general issues going on that may have to do with financing, they may have to do with the demand side of the economy. I don't have
regardless of whether they're foreign-born or not.
Yeah, regardless of whether they're immigrants or not. I do think there are special issues for the foreign-born. Actually, I want to focus just for a second because I think this is a big untapped opportunity. The Council on Foreign Relations, we published a paper last year written by Alexandra Starr, who's a fellow of the New America Foundation, on Latino immigrant entrepreneurship. And Latino is a broad category. A lot of these are Mexicans because that's the largest immigrant group in the United States. A lot of untapped opportunity here. Generally, their business startup rates are lower than for other immigrant groups. Generally, the businesses that they establish are smaller. But with the proximity of Latin American markets, there are tremendous untapped opportunities there. So I sometimes think we break the immigration debate very much into sort of high-skilled immigration, which is all those Asians coming over, and low-skilled immigration, the undocumented, which is all the folks from Mexico and Latin America. I'm not sure it works that way. I think there are big opportunities there. If you want to ask me one way to unleash more entrepreneurship, it'd be to legalize many of the 11 million undocumented. If you're undocumented, it's pretty hard to start a company. You certainly can't do it in a formal way. You have to do it in a gray market way. There are unauthorized immigrants who start companies, but I know one story. A guy was successful in establishing a number of restaurants in New York City and was basically fleeced out of them by a partner and had no way to defend himself because he didn't have legal status in the United States. So there are a number of things I think that can be done in the immigration reform context that really would help to try to gin up entrepreneurship in this community and not just the sort of way we have come to think about it of smart master's PhD students who go to Silicon Valley. I think there are a lot of other dimensions to it.
Great. Other comments either on Dutch entrepreneurs that you obviously have to talk to who come over here to the United States because you're here at the embassy.
If I may, just to whatever relate a bit to the research I did a while ago to give an answer to what are the dynamics behind the decline in the rate or the growth of immigrant firms. My research was focused on immigrant entrepreneurship in the Netherlands in the clothing sector, from the perspective of global supply chains and sourcing strategies of retailers. Now that took place. The period was somewhere late 80s, early 90s, let's say, at the beginning of the new economy, when these retailers were still struggling with including new IT in logistics in a way that they could further globalize fast cycles, fashion cycle products in their supply chain in a way that was further away from the consumer. That was a period of time where, hence, there was a need. If some beautiful Dutch presenter on television wore a certain dress on Monday, they wanted that to have in the shops on Wednesday. And you could just not get that from Hong Kong at that time. So the reason why these sweatshops came up at that time had very much to do that there was no alternative for retailers than trying to do it in Amsterdam again.
Right.
A couple of years further, when this IT was more included in these sourcing strategies, that became less necessary because they could organize it in such a way that even these short cycle fashion products could be in the shops in a couple of days. I mean, apart from that, the Berlin Wall fell and we had the Eastern Europeans who jumped in and things like that. But there is so much part of the rise and decline in immigrant entrepreneurship linked to these global supply chains and the niches that they create or eliminate it for that kind of supply.
Comments on the difficulties that immigrant entrepreneurs are facing, what accounts for the drop?
I think, it could be just a drop. It's a drop because a lot of, especially our foreign students who study in the United States, are mostly from Asia. Mm-hmm. And we have to remember that a large majority of these countries that they come from have emerged and are thriving. Even though the United States is still has the largest amount of R&D, we're number one for students as well as number one for R&D spending in the world. There's a lot of other countries that are competing in terms of having government funds. China right now, even though it's still about, the U.S. has $365 billion in 2009 in investing in R&D. China's raising its R&D spending, but yet they're still 2.5 times less than the United States. But my point is that I think there's probably a lot more opportunities back in their home countries that are attracting these highly skilled, especially PhD and master's types who may have opportunities in their home countries.
I've met a couple of entrepreneurs who ended up starting their company from India, who ended up starting their company in India, who said, it's funny, we came back here reluctantly because we waited and we waited and we waited and we gave up waiting and we decided the market opportunity was now. So we did it in India, but the reality was we were still allowed to travel to the United States. Our network of potential investors and customers and people to help us, but we, having spent a lot of time in the United States, we can take that with us on our laptop. It's not like or it exists on the cloud. Yeah. And they said, and actually it ended up being an advantage to them because they said, actually, we think we probably scaled the firm faster here than we would have done in the United States. So maybe the opportunities back home are underestimated from people that came to the United States, spent some time here either as a student or as a researcher, and then went home. So
you hear this in Latin America as well. In Alexander's research, she talked to a number of Latino immigrant entrepreneurs who've gone back to places like Chile and Argentina, other places. And one of the things I noticed is the competition there is not quite as tough. If you've got a good idea in the United States, there are probably 8 other people who have the same idea. And competing there, the entrepreneurial culture is not as developed. A good idea often has more legs. So we're seeing this kind of diffusion.
And I think the other thing we're seeing in startup communities is more and more Americans actually going, actually from Silicon Valley. I met one, and he said, on my street on Silicon Valley, if I don't have a successful high-growth startup, I'm a failure. Because everybody on the block has had a successful, at least
And
one
you can't
successful.
afford to live there if you
I
don't.
can,
So.
and he says, and then there I'm just another brick in the wall. Here, I'm a rock star, and I'm the center of a community. So let's, if we can, move on to talk a little bit about before we go to further questions. I'd like to see if, maybe I don't know which one of you would like to do this, but to just give us give our audience a quick summary of what is in this immigration bill. I know that we're talking about H1B visa reform. We're talking about broadly from a perspective here. We're talking about maybe creating a new startup visa. We're talking about a bill which obviously, as you said, takes us away from this polarized approach in the past of dealing with high-skilled immigration separately to dealing with the broader immigration issue. Would you like to give us a quick summary here?
Yeah, I think I'll just give a broad and just a lot of it's a very complicated bill.
Yep.
But the Senate bill has
800 pages. Yeah.
1,000 plus amendments. I think that what it really does, though, is basically kind of shift over 5 years. If this is passed in the Senate, it would shift it to a more of a merit-based, skills-based system. So right now, we have the country caps. So if you're from India and China, it's very difficult to get a green card. If your employer sponsors you, you would have to wait up to 10 years. In this system, they would assign points based on your educational background, degrees, employment experience, even relatives in the United States, and age. So it would be, think of it as a college admissions based on various attributes. That's how I'd think of what they're proposing. It would also increase the number of H1B visas, but it would also still put some protections for American workers by charging higher fees that would go to a STEM education fund. So that Americans won't be left behind. It would also allow foreign students to have what they call dual intent if you're on the F1 visa. That means an employer could hire you straight away without having to go through the H1B system, straight to a green card. And the big one also is the Invest visa, which has these certain requirements. It's a 3-year visa, or it could be a green card if you create a certain amount of jobs and raise a certain amount of capital. So those are kind of the broader deal with high-skilled immigration.
I'd like to turn to a clip, if we can, of someone that talks about some of the complexity, the problems they've had with the H1B visa complexities. And I want to ask both of you if you think what we're going to do with this legislation is going to address the concerns raised in this clip. So if we can have that now, that'd be great.
If a worker under an H1B comes up with an idea that they believe might make a lot of money and they want to spin it off into their own business, can they do it? Or are there impediments built into their status? Vivek?
The funny thing is that you can start a company if you're on H1B visa, you can't work for it. So this happens to my students all the time. It's really bizarre.
Well, you'd have to reapply, actually.
It's so complicated. You have to have a board of directors. You can't own more than X% of the company. It is so cumbersome that I know students who've tried, they just got frustrated and said, we'll just leave and start our company somewhere else.
Okay, so I want to give credit there to my former colleague Bob Lighton, who's now with Bloomberg, was instrumental in a lot of the Kauffman, initiating a lot of the Kauffman research in this space, and also Vivek Wadhwa, who, if you're interested in further reading after this panel, are both two great sources. So is what we're going to do going to address this? Are we going to fix the problem that's mentioned there? We laughed about.
I think there are a number of things that will be better. I mean, the system really is messed up currently. One of my favorite examples is this. We do have an investor's visa currently. So if you're either investing $1 million in a project or $500,000 in a poor community, you can qualify for a visa. But there's a wonderful story. This Mexican-Japanese guy in Texas who Alexander interviewed, Alfonso Tomito is his name, who established a whole successful chain of sushi restaurants in Texas. Wonderful kind of innovative idea. He's got a big thriving business, but in order to qualify for the investor visa, it has to be new money. It has to be new money coming from outside. So the fact that he's established a successful business that is earning a lot of money in the United States and employing a lot of people, that doesn't qualify for investor's visa. So he's still stuck on a temporary visa. So you see this across the board. There are some good things, I think, in the Senate bill. I think the H-1B is an employee visa. I think there are ways in which it will be better. It's going to be a bit more portable. And we are talking about creating an entrepreneur's visa, where in effect, if you can show that you've got investors interested in your project, you can qualify for a visa on that basis. So that guy who's working on H-1B who wants to start his own company, in theory, if he could go and say, look, I've got angel investors willing to put $200,000 into my project or $500,000, then he could move from the H-1B to this new category of visa. So in theory, I think that's a pretty good idea. There are things that are not in there that I really would like to see. I don't know why we don't have the equivalent of what's called optional practical training for entrepreneurs. So if you're now a graduate in science, technology, or engineering from a U.S. university, you can stay in the country for about 2.5 years on a temporary work permit they call optional practical training. That's basically, just try out working in the United States if you've got an employer. And at some point, if you want to stay, you've got to transition to one of these other visas. Why not let people, for instance, who are going through the incubators, a Y Combinator or Techstars, who are successful in those incubators, let them stay for 2 years, 2.5 years. Try their hand at starting a company, and then establish some criteria for what success would be that would allow you to move to a more permanent kind of visa. So I think it could be better, but definitely there are things in the bill that are better than the status quo.
Yeah, and of course the problem with that entrepreneur's visa you mentioned is that, of course, we're moving into an era where, for the first few years anyway, entrepreneurs are leaner than they've ever been. It requires less capital to start a company than it ever used to. And Kauffman research has shown that less than 16% of high growth firms take any outside venture capital. So the idea of having all that, what do you do with the remaining 80% of startups that actually manage to do it without taking outside capital? So
I mean, it's a crude way of trying to deal with this problem I laid out, which is the selection problem. It's not a really particularly good system.
Yeah. Well, the question came up that if what is the average American's concern about this, and I want you to comment if you can on what are the concerns about opening doors too widely to high-skilled immigrants. But if the average concern is, well, I'm worried they're going to take away a neighbor's job or my job, should we not measure entrepreneurs based upon whether or not they're actually a net sum gain of jobs? And there's ways of measuring. Is that a better way to do it than whether they happen to have friends with money that can bring money from outside the United States? All of you, I'd just like to throw that out. Let's look at this from the other idea. What should our concerns be about opening the doors? What is the primary concern of the elected official that represents individuals in America that say, I'm anxious about the fact we're opening these doors? Is it that someone will take away my job?
I mean, I do think. Let's put entrepreneurs aside for the moment. Just talk generally about high-skilled visas.
Sure.
So increasing in significant numbers the number of people with university educations and beyond, particularly in the STEM fields. I do think there is an issue of what the incentive becomes for American students. So there is some kind of supply and demand issue. I don't argue with the companies when the Microsofts and Googles say they want to find the best people from anywhere in the world, and that's something that they should be able to do. But if you bring in lots of folks with a certain skill set, the effect of that tends to be to tamp down wages in that field. That's basic supply and demand economics. And the Canadians, for instance, have had problems with this. Their system is biased towards that higher skill end, and they've seen, from their data, what they consider wage suppression at the high end. People are not getting the kind of raises that their skills would justify because there just are too many people competing in that area of the market. So I don't think it's necessarily true to say that because we want high-skilled folks, we want an unlimited number of high-skilled folks. I do think there are some reasonable lines that can be drawn. I think the numbers in a lot of cases are too low now. There are others who disagree. We think that in a lot of fields.
Can you give us a non-American perspective on that? I mean, have you had the same problems that the Canadians have?
It's such an interesting pleasure to hear American friends call for a role of government in these kind of issues. Europeans, whatever, usually get that kind of comments the other way around. I think that of course there's all kind of policy goals and concerns in society related to immigration. I mean, if they're founded in econometrics or not, I mean, they're still very valid and they have to be addressed, of course, in policy making. I would think that if you would look at it from an economic perspective, that you actually can find enough guarantees through a simple market-driven system in controlling your supply and demand. We have, as I said before, a demand-driven, so it's the employer who asks for the work permit for a high-skilled migrant. We've simplified that to the extent that for wages above a certain level, the kind of check if there's alternative supply on the labor market has been abolished. So we basically assume that in wage levels that are slightly high, that there is indeed enough demand in the Dutch market, which is not competing with local supply, I suppose. On the entrepreneurial side, and that's what I said before, I think, of course, there's a concurrence of different systems where we have adopted more of a point system, but a point system based on what the economic relevance of such new startup would be for the Dutch economy. Now, that's, of course, a terrible, vague way of putting into legislation, but I think the way it helped us, because it has educational characteristics, it has some kind of market potential estimate, it has some estimates of invested capital and business plan criteria. But all, I think, in a way where there is a very smooth way of checking, looking if somebody indeed is serious, I mean, let's put it like that, in making the best for his family in the Netherlands, and then letting them go. I mean, if you're indeed your PhD student, you can stay for a year, you don't lose your visa straight away. In that year, you can set up that company. And then we'll look at it from this perspective, is it economically relevant? And he or she will do it. I mean, I mean, indeed, whatever. Sometimes, perhaps in Europe, there is a policy-driven approach to these kinds of things that actually helps entrepreneurship.
Have we thought about this in the United States, providing an extension to some of our higher education success stories from outside? You know, allowing them to stay a year or two and say, look, you know, if you're intended to start a company, we'll give you a time limit, and if it doesn't work out, then you should head home.
We do it if you've got an employer. We do it if somebody's willing to hire.
Yeah,
you,
but I'm saying if you,
startups.
I'm saying if you don't, for not for non-employees. Let me ask two quick questions, and then I'd like to go to some questions from the group. One is I want to make sure that we don't forget to mention the great piece that the Council on Foreign Relations did on Latino immigrant entrepreneurs and some of the challenges they face. Do you want to give us a few quick comments on that? Because I mean, obviously here in the United States, the Latino population, while they may not start firms, as fast as maybe other groups, that obviously is a very large part of the story. And I think you have. I just wanted to see if we have some comments on that.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned a couple of the high points of the study, but I think that there's a larger point here, which is actually as a country, we do pretty poorly at looking towards economic opportunities in Latin America. I think it's partly, it was a long history with the negotiation of NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. It was a traumatic thing politically here in Washington. I think people kind of got scared away. And trade expansion with Latin America just doesn't have the place on the table that it ought to have. But if you look about it, we were talking earlier on in this discussion about these networks, about, you talk about Dutch coming over to the United States, and that there's a lot of good research that shows that kind of movement opens trade channels, right? So that, the Dutch entrepreneur who comes here and establishes a company is likely to look for suppliers back home, and so there's kind of spin-off benefits. We can see the same thing with a number of these successful Latino businesses that have been established in the United States, Brightstar, which is a big cell company, and others, where that kind of connection brings, in the case of Brightstar, Argentina together with the United States. You see other examples like this. So I think that there's a real advantage here. We have this large Latino immigrant population, which in a way has a kind of privileged access and understanding to these Latin American markets, a number of which are growing quite rapidly. We don't take advantage of that in the way we should. So there were other issues raised in that study as well, but the big takeaway was that this is just a huge untapped opportunity. I mean, Latino is a broad category, but about 2/3 of our immigration come from, the immigrants come from Spanish-speaking countries. I mean, the other big advantage is domestically, right? This is a fast-growing market. This is the fastest-growing segment of the U.S. population. So again, there's a domestic consumer market there as well, which these folks have a kind of privileged understanding of. So we just, when we did the study, we came away seeing this as an enormous untapped opportunity.
That's great. And last question before we go to outside questions. I want to make sure that we also touch briefly, if we can, on how we can kind of, are there other things we should do just to retain our best foreign students with an interest in STEM fields? This has obviously been very much a theme as part of our immigration debate. But, you know, sort of stepping outside of the sort of entrepreneurship piece for a second here, you know, talk to us a little bit about what else we should be doing in that regard.
Yeah, I mean, right now under the current system, I mean, we have, our numbers show that there's about 600,000 foreign students coming per year. That was in 2010. And the difficulty is that, you know, the option right now is either they stay in OPT, which is optional practical training for 12 months to extend their student visa. If they're in a STEM field, it would be 29 months. But the problem is that, you know, they have to compete for these H1B visas right now if they want to stay longer and sponsored by employer. If they're an entrepreneur, there's no way unless they maybe got an appointment with the university to stay longer. But right now, only about just under 20,000 of them were F1 students, former students that get retained under the H1B program every year. So it's a lot smaller than the 100,000 that every year get issued. And I think the Senate bill has a proposal to make the F1 a dual intent program, which I mentioned earlier, which will allow the employers to sponsor them directly from the F1 visa. Because right now, a typical foreign student would go from F1, apply for the OPT, then they would apply for H1B, then hope, if they're from China or India, wait a long time under the H1B for 10 years until they get their green card. So I think this will resolve that issue and will streamline.
Yeah, and all of this is sometimes completing these processes when English isn't necessarily your first language. So.
Well, I think a lot of people don't realize how hard it is to live here on an H-1B visa. You know, if you're married, for instance, your spouse can't work unless he or she's got status independently. So, and you know, you've been on H-1B for 10 years. You have to renew it constantly. When you travel abroad, it can be a real hassle. I did a big piece for Newsweek a couple of years ago about a young Indian man who went back home, and every time you go home on the H-1B, it's in effect as if you'd entered the first time, and he got caught up in this ridiculous background check security review, lost his job here. It took him years to return. So it's a very kind of tenuous status. Mm-hmm. So it's not surprising that people with real talent and real opportunities will say, I don't necessarily want to stay in the United States 10 years on an H-1B.
Yeah. That's maybe one of the reasons they're going home. Not always. Maybe it's just the unpleasant experience. Do we want to take some questions from? If anybody's got any questions for the panels?
Anyone have a question? I can pass the microphone around. Just say your name.
I'm Bob Hershey. I'm a consultant. Which of these various things that have been talked about for helping the program would show the best return to we citizens in the United States?
I'm not.
Anybody got a bias towards one component of this either the legislation or the effort to reform immigration that would
Well, this is where we started, but I think the entrepreneur's visa is potentially the biggest benefit for all the reasons you talk about in terms of the value of startup, and probably the fewest downsides. I mean, because with people who are getting jobs at U.S. companies, there always is the issue of competition with American workers. If you're starting a brand new company, right, those are new jobs you're creating. So I think it's hard to put them side by side and necessarily come up with a really good estimate of the economic value. But on the entrepreneur side, I see kind of unlimited upside potential and very little downside potential. Whereas the issues with expansion of H-1Bs are a little more complicated. I think there are some potential downsides there.
differing opinions from?
No, I mean, far from a specialist in the different proposals on the table, but the openness in your economy. I mean, if you look at the impact and significance of the relationship with the Netherlands in trade and investment for the United States, 680,000 jobs here in the United States as the population of Washington, D.C. are directly related to that. So one way or another, it will always be openness that will make sure that you get the biggest benefit of what you're doing there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and go ahead.
Yeah, I think that, I agree with him. Like, in terms of openness would benefit everyone in the United States, I think. But if this bill is passed the way it is, it gives more choices so that people won't get stuck under a certain visa and people have to go home. But at the same time, I think we still have to figure out how to make sure we give opportunities for Americans. And to do that, there's certain provisions, this big STEM education fund from all the visa fees from the green cards and H1B would be a benefit for Americans. It's one way of letting an H1B worker come, but make sure you have funds for Americans so they won't get displaced. I think it's really about trying to find that balance.
Yeah. And I think the other dimension on this is it's not just which benefits the best, but also which is in a way the most urgent. And I think from the kind of I know we have Shelley here who ran the Global Entrepreneurship Program at the Department of State, and one of the things that we've all collectively seen outside the United States is not just a massive increase in the effort of other countries to bring that bright talent into their startup communities, as evidenced by people like the government of Chile with Startup Chile, where they actually will pay you $40,000 to come and start a company in Santiago, and you don't have to pay it back. But there's such a and also you've got things like Geeks on a Plane, and you've got the Nordic Vikings and all sorts of groups of Americans here who fly to those countries, and they're looking to engage themselves in those startup communities as either investors or entrepreneurs. So in a way, you've kind of got a competitive thing here, that if we don't do something that makes it easier for that talent, some of that talent, hard to deal with the selection process, but some of that talent to come, we will no longer have a level playing field. In fact, we will have lost the competitive advantage, and you'll find more and more American entrepreneurs saying, actually, you know what, I don't want to stay here in Silicon Valley anymore. I've got much better opportunities in Sao Paulo. So, other questions?
Thanks. And thanks, Jonathan. This is a great panel. Shelley Portis, former director of Global Entrepreneurship Program at the State Department, as recently as 2 months ago. And a big fan of American abroad media. Thanks for hosting this program. The question is, so right now, as we're waiting for our legislators to come around to these realizations, these important decisions, the system is now based on country quotas, correct? Are we taking full advantage of the country quotas, and is there a way? Are we at full capacity, or is there a way for us to be promoting immigration through some countries that may not be full, where we may not be realizing the full potential of what the quota allows? Because it seems to me, one of the statistics that you haven't brought up, although you sort of tangentially referred to, is that fewer than or less than 1% of American small businesses export. And of course, we're on a big export binge right now. And of those 1%, only 60% of those export to one country, and it's for the very reasons that you mentioned, because they have a personal tie to that country somehow. So, it seems to me like while we're waiting, could we be doing something else to realize that potential?
Any of our panelists want to comment on that?
I mean, I can take the last piece, which again, I think this is another argument for doing all we can on the immigrant entrepreneur front. One of the stats we had in our paper on Latino entrepreneurship was if you look at Latino-owned firms, actually 3% of Latino-owned firms generate more than half of their revenue from exports. Doesn't sound like a huge number, but that's actually higher than for Asian-owned firms. And the average American-owned firm gets 0.5% of its revenue from exports. So it was one of the data points we use to show the advantages of proximity, and again, an opportunity we can exploit. The question on country quotas, maybe you know better than I do. I mean, they don't get filled every year, and there actually are provisions in the bill to recapture some of these, but I can't say I completely understand why they don't all get filled every year.
Yeah.
Immigration is very complex in this country.
I mean, with Ted, it's also very complicated to get the country cap, but I think, to get at your point, I think that one thing that you could do, and then you were at the State Department, is that just think about it. The U.S. is the biggest immigrant receiving country in the world. Our immigrants are economic ambassadors that they contribute to two economies simultaneously. Many of them send remittances back home, over $60 billion a year. And they have these networks and connections with their home communities. So I think that one thing while we're waiting, maybe the State Department, I know they've been trying to figure out about diaspora networks. There would be programs to connect the immigrants who are here so they can have opportunities for entrepreneurial activities back home, to make it easier to facilitate that. And there are many governments out there that really want to tap their diasporas, their American-born or diasporas in America, to go back or do activity there, and it mutually benefits both economies. So I think we should really benefit, these economic ambassadors that are living in the United States. That's our greatest asset, I think.
Yeah, I really agree with Neil. I mean, state is doing some of this. There is this International Diaspora Engagement Alliance. So I think there are people there who understand it, but I think there's a lot more that could be done on that front.
Yeah, and there's always, as you say, more opportunities even beyond diaspora that we can be doing. There's still a lot of issues for which the immigration bill is not really the impediment. So,
if I may, Jonathan,
yeah.
one more thing adding to that in the last bit of what the lady said in terms of the percentage of U.S. firms and immigrant firms exporting. There is, I think, I mean, in the discussion that we have, also in the way you phrased it yourself, otherwise that Silicon Valley entrepreneur will leave the country and set up his business somewhere else. I think one of the things that you have to do in America is make sure that he does. That's not a danger, that's an opportunity. If you keep on looking at yourself as, are we still the magnet and how can we make ourselves more of a magnet, but you don't reach out, then you may lose as much as this battle on talent in attracting people. When we organize a Holland in the Valley boot camp for Dutch startups in California, there's plenty of things that whatever the people learn there, the Dutch guys and women in doing business in the United States, we let them pitch for VCs. Sometimes it works. I mean, they find a partner and go work with that. We also talk with the incubator on the California side and say, like, you're very welcome to come to the other side. I mean, we've got whatever. There's no country in the world where United States companies invest as much in as in the Netherlands. We're the third largest investor here in the United States, so we've got something to offer. Why don't you come over? But I mean, sometimes the other side of the table basically thinks, yeah, you come here to learn from us. Eh? I mean, is it really necessary for you or else to come there? I mean, of course not. I mean, it's up to you. But if you want to compete internationally, indeed, perhaps these incubators and these high-tech startups, these bright men and women, they should get on that plane to Mumbai or to Amsterdam, of course.
Yeah, and fortunately, I think there's an awful lot of American entrepreneurs that are doing that, and I think there's a growing sense that we shouldn't all be, or other communities around the world shouldn't all be trying to imitate Silicon Valley, which has been one of the biggest challenges. But I just want you to know that in our Global Entrepreneurship Week campaign, perhaps our biggest competition occurs in Rotterdam, international competition. And they had the creativity to come up with a huge church, which I understand is one of the largest in Europe, which they put a boxing ring in the center, and startups compete to win a competition. But the critical part of it is they want people to come from all over the world, and they don't try to sell them on being in the Netherlands. So it's a testament to what you're saying. Other questions, please.
Good afternoon. My name is Tom Hewitt. I'm the co-founder and director of the International Skills Standards Organisation. I guess the clue there is in the title of the organisation. We work with many countries and parts of the world on this particular specs issue of how you link the skills of immigrants to things like visa requirements. Just want to thank the panel actually for a fascinating discussion. A quick observation, really, and then really a question directed at the panel. I mean, I was part of my week-long business trip here to the United States. I was actually standing at the South Factory of Manhattan Island as a Kingston Castle. I think it's an old British fort, actually, but there's a sign outside that says that between 1855 and 1890, around 8 million migrants or immigrants embarked at that point. And I think it sort of gives you a sense, really, of this country's great heritage and tradition in being open and welcoming. That's why it's slightly odd in a way as an outsider and to sort of hear a debate which is very technical and very complex and really talking about relatively small amounts of numbers in terms of welcoming people to the United States. My question really was around this issue of international collaboration, because there are organisations that look at, for example, harmonisation of free trade, obviously since particularly the crash of 2008, huge efforts going into international agreement around things like tax avoidance and regulating financial capital flows, which move relatively freely across the world. Do you think maybe America's missing a trick in not displaying more leadership, perhaps at the G20 or some other multilateral level, in trying to crack some of these issues around migration, particularly as they impact on local populations? because obviously free movement of people is not the same as the free movement of goods and capital in terms of the actual effect that they have on communities. So do you think there's a missed opportunity, I guess is my question, in terms of American leadership?
Good question. To some degree, have we looked at this in the context of how open should our borders, open or closed should our borders be, rather than looking at it from the context of, if America's very lucky to be a country that all people will want to come to, maybe there's also a responsibility with that to take some global leadership. Is any thoughts on that?
I mean, I work on trade a lot, so I could make a comment. It's one of the things I love about Washington is that no matter what panel you sit on, there's somebody in the audience who knows far more about the topic than you do. And it's a great thing. The city is just, we talk about wealth of talent. Now, our talent here is a different sort of talent. But it is actually, it's an amazing place in that regard. So thank you for a really good question. It is quite striking when you look at immigration, how little international cooperation there is. I mean, there is an international migration organization. It's essentially a data gathering body. There are efforts in international cooperation on refugees, which are very positive through the United Nations. But in terms of these big questions of the movement of people, surprisingly little, and I think there's the potential for great gain, for the recognition that we talked about on this panel earlier, that mobility is increasingly becoming a fact of modern life, particularly for people with more skills, and that if we can negotiate arrangements, ideally multilaterally. Some of this is done, you see bits of this in free trade agreements. There's in the NAFTA, there's some mobility provisions. In the U.S.-Singapore free trade agreement, there's some mobility provisions. There's very little. I mean, the basic attitude in the United States on immigration is this is absolutely a sovereign issue. It's not only a sovereign issue, it's entirely in the responsibility of Congress. And we don't really want to talk to anybody else in the world about it. And I agree with you. I think that's a very short-sighted position that really is an abdication of leadership. And unfortunately, as in so many of these areas, if the United States doesn't lead, there's nobody else who's kind of powerful enough to take the leadership role on that and to sort of knock us over the head and say, we need to look at this issue in a broader context.
Yeah, I mean, we as a world, we haven't been even successful. I mean, I know APEC's done it where you can streamline and simplify the visa processes for business people traveling within the APEC economies.
It took
big deal.
6 years to do that, I
exactly.
think, maybe longer. It was incredibly difficult.
Maybe you've got things like global entry programs and making faster people get through customs. I mean, there's a few really sort of on the edges of this, but there's no big picture thinking about the fact that people ultimately are these carriers of great intellectual property. And that, perspectives on this from the Netherlands.
This is probably a question that my ambassador would advise me not to take, but I'm going to leave in the summer, so give it a try. But the international arena where I think there is United States leadership, even though Europeans might not always agree, is in the services agreement in the WTO, of course, where there is a strong linkage between the liberalization of trade in services and the movement of people, including entrepreneurs. And I think it would be, that in my view, would be the most important angle if you would want to mobilize it. If you do it in terms of immigration or visa policy, I mean, that remains so politically complex. If you relate it to, by whatever, far the most important and growing sector in the world economy, which is services, and you make sure that you combine or link parts of mobility of firms and people to that, I think that would do everybody a big favor if indeed the United States would pick that up even more.
I will tell you, this issue came up at an international gathering of entrepreneurs, and the great thing is all they could see was opportunity. There was one entrepreneur I met in New Zealand who I met him because I went, it was 5 o'clock in the morning, it was dark, and I was about to do a business show, and I went into this coffee shop, and I said, "Are you open?" He goes, "Yep, not only am I open, this is my first day in business, and you're my first customer." And I said, "Oh, that's great, I'm here to talk about entrepreneurship, so tell me a story." Turns out that rather than having coffee in the back room, he had computers, and he was Israeli born, had some ideas about a technology app that he wanted to develop. He developed a relationship with some students at the University of Auckland, and he said, "I got to go get these guys working with me closer." So he got on a plane. And, he read the Doing Business study of the World Bank and said, "It's really easy to start a business in New Zealand." He said, "Oh, well, good." So he flies to New Zealand and rents this place, says, "Oh, I haven't got any money, so I'll do a coffee shop to get me going," and ends up with these students that he's paying a pittance to help him do development work. And he said, he says, "I'm not going to go for outside capital, but I've already got customers in the United States." And I said, "Oh, that's great. Where?" And he goes, and he mentioned in California, and I said, have you been there? No, actually, I've never been to the United States, but I got the customers. They actually came to see me. So, here's someone who just thought globally as an entrepreneur, didn't think anything about the fact. I said, this is great, and he looked at me as if, what's the big deal? It's like, there's these things called airplanes that fly 4 flights a day, between Tel Aviv and whatever. I mean, what's so strange about this? So, maybe we have a lot to learn, as usual, from entrepreneurs as the leaders. When your moderator has an affiliation with the Kauffman Foundation, I'm afraid I'll probably be a little bit more biased in giving credit to the entrepreneurs in leading us out of this mess. Are there other questions that anybody else wants to address? Okay, we'll take one here, and then I'm going to be inviting the panel to take a couple of minutes each to tell us what we have not talked about that we would be remiss not to mention. So, to give you the notice.
Thank you. Lynn Van Fleet with Diplomacy Matters. We're a nonprofit organization. And as the name implies, we try and connect the diplomatic community with the U.S. community, especially in terms of innovation and startups. So I have a, first of all, a recommendation, testimonial. Thank you all for an expert panel. But I also want to give a little bit of homework to everybody who's here. You heard from Holland in the Valley. Edward, you gave a great perspective on networks and how important they are. There are so many networks that the U.S. could learn about, international collaboration, and Kiwi Landing Pad is one, Startup Chile is another, and Finland is actually, they have a relationship with the UCLA Anderson School of Management and Techis to advise their startup companies in Finland with the expertise of MBA students in California. So thank you very much, and I'd just like to say we all need to study a little bit more. It wasn't a question.
Thank you for the comment, and thank you for pointing this out. Network theory is in a boom right now. It is extraordinary how you don't really need to create networks; they just happen, and there are hundreds of them getting created all the time. And the most common denominator with them, fortunately, thanks to technology and the liberalization of communication systems, is they're global, and that's a very exciting thing. If you're one of the people who wakes up in the morning and reads the paper and get worried about the future, I think there's a lot of optimism to be had from what is a much greater degree of intersection between people of different cultures, where I think is where great things happen. So, comments on the network thing before we wrap up, or.
No, you're all very welcome, not only in the Holland and the Valley boot camp that we do in California as well as in New York, but also, of course, to come to the other side of the big pond and see what's going on over there. So that's absolutely.
Well, I'm going to ask each of our panelists. We covered some ground in a random way here to give a sense of what's happening with this issue, but I wanted to give you all an opportunity to close up with either a couple of observations about something that we've missed, or something that you think that would help bring this together. And also, if you would, each, I hate to do this to you, but they do this on Sunday morning talk shows, but tell us on a scale of 1 to 5 what you think the likelihood is we're going to see an immigration bill coming out this year.
Okay. Yeah, I guess I'll spin off from the networks. I think the United States, with the biggest immigrant receiving country in the world, we're attracting the most students, anyone studying abroad. We have the most R&D spending. We have a comparative advantage and major assets for research, R&D, innovation, and entrepreneurship in the U.S. And I think the challenge is to think about how do we keep it open, but also at the same time protecting Americans to have those opportunities. In terms of networks, I think we've been talking about this at the level of national level and give examples of Silicon Valley, but there's a lot of networks going on in metropolitan areas throughout the U.S. In reports that I've published on H1Bs, we saw that it's not just Silicon Valley where H1B workers are in high demand, but it's in Silicon Prairie, in Iowa, or in Columbus, Indiana, where Cummins Incorporated is located, or Peoria, Fayetteville, where Walmart is located, or Caterpillar. So we have a lot of, the U.S. is huge, and there's a lot of students also that are not necessarily just going to the large metropolitan areas, but the study I just released last month, most foreign students are actually going, the largest proportion of foreign students to the student population is in middle of America. In Arkansas State University in Jonesboro, Arkansas, Florence, Alabama, University of North Alabama, Ames, Iowa, Iowa State. There are probably opportunities there where we will see entrepreneurship, foreigners there. How do you connect what goes on in those economies, those regional economies, with the origins of where they're coming from? So I think we see a lot of opportunities, growth in different areas that we haven't seen yet.
I'd like to make an argument for a government role that maybe even Kauffman could get enthusiastic about, which is to do a much better job
We
at
love
data,
the government.
data
Sets
gathering.
the rules, sets the rules and the incentives. You know?
Exactly. Which is to do a much better job at data gathering and dissemination. I learned something recently from the Canadians, which I hadn't known, which is they have tracked the labor market performance of their immigrants through tax rolls and through payroll information and things, going all the way back to 1980. So they've discovered, for instance, that individuals who've immigrated to Canada who have foreign university credentials tend to underperform. They haven't done tremendously well. The credentials don't really match up very well with the Canadian market. And so they're beginning to try to adjust their selection system to privilege people who've come and studied at Canadian universities and graduate from Canadian universities or American universities or places where the credentials match better. We really need a lot more information on how immigrants are doing. Those who come and start companies or those who come and work, how are they doing in the labor market? What are the characteristics of those who succeed and those who don't do so well? So that if we're going to see immigration as a selection system that helps our economic competitiveness, we've got some real data, and we should open it up to groups like Kauffman and others to do rigorous analysis on. And we're not just kind of throwing darts at a dartboard and thinking, hopefully, these are the kind of people who will help us. I just think there's so much more we could do to take this seriously as an area of potential economic advantage and gather the information that will help the government and other entities make intelligent decisions going forward as a really long-term project.
That's great. And before your final comment, can you just, in response to what was just said, are you satisfied with the amount of data that's collected in the Netherlands for what happens to people that come from outside of the Netherlands? Maybe not.
The question is, I'm not satisfied because that's also because I got a terrible curiosity about these kind of things. So that's not necessarily the fault of our statistical bureau. But I was in the OECD working group on entrepreneurial statistics for some time, and indeed, not just in defining the data, but also make sure that you set up the methodologies and making to do that. Of course, the entrepreneurship monitor Kauffman does fantastic work, but how do you broaden that amongst Western world and beyond? We've been working a lot with our queen Maxima these days in microfinance and making sure that we have the data also in developing countries and what's going on there with small firms and their needs of finance. That's also data if you want to develop policies there. So there certainly is I think a need to do that more. I also think that apart from the data, there is fantastic ways you can do comparative international research, not just in the performance data, but also in looking at the different beautiful countries that we have as natural experiments, where we can compare performance of entrepreneurs in the background of different institutional setups. When I was doing my SweatUp research in Amsterdam, and I had a group of colleagues coming over from New York and Miami and what have you, Birmingham, London, and I took them to a number of these sweatshops in Amsterdam, and we knew the Turkish guy who owned it, so we opened the door and they looked around, and guys from Miami said to me, "That's not a sweatshop. That's a perfectly nice, ordinary firm." So there is, apart from expectations and norms and values by these things, there is differences which have to do, of course, with the institutions that you have in your country. If you can take, apart from the data, that into account and compare why some firms grow faster than others, then I think we're doing ourselves a great favor. I will certainly say 5 in my terrible optimism here about the United States political process. So I think that there will be an outcome in this. And to conclude maybe with what a British colleague or British publisher of a book that Roy Turek, who is a Dutch professor in entrepreneurship, you might know him, presented in Brussels a while ago. And this British guy was asked, like, what's the basis of your success? A fantastic book in entrepreneurship. And he said, well, it's globalization, it's my wife, and it's a carton box. Well, everybody got the gist of the globalization, whatever, and his wife, he explained a bit, fantastic woman, helped him and everything. And the carton box remains. Why the carton box? Well, he said, I used that to put all the brochures and information that I got from the government in and put it on top of my cupboard, never had a look at it, and I think if I had opened it, that would not help my situation. Perhaps to conclude with this also.
We didn't do odds, did we?
You guys didn't do odds. Didn't do it. Before you do odds, I have to say this is great. Where we got an American suggesting we should have maybe a little bit more government engagement, and somebody else suggesting let's put the government stuff in a box up on the shelf from Europe. So we love this. But let's go to odds if we can. So.
I've been in Washington far too long. There is an irony that foreigners are much more optimistic about the United States than Americans these days. The best I can do is 4.
Okay, well, 4's pretty good.
4's not bad.
4's actually pretty good.
I do think the odds are reasonably good.
Well, they're more than 50%.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say 4 as well.
Okay.
I would agree.
Okay, gang of 8 will be happy that things are moving in that direction. And I want to also compliment our guests from the outside the United States. I had the great pleasure of meeting then last November, Princess Maxima, and I was astonished because I was about to go on the stage to talk at an event in The Hague, and someone said to me, "Do you realize that after you is Princess Maxima? She's the speaker." And I said, "Oh, that's great." And I said, "When she arrived?" And they go, "She's down here. She's going to sit here and listen to you." And I was actually, giving frankly, a typical Kauffman data talk. And I said, she's here, she's got to sit through that. I've got 20 minutes. Does she really, and they said, well, and so I was going to compliment you on the fact that she's probably the first queen of any country that takes an interest in entrepreneurship data. Maybe we have some leadership there that we should take from. But I want to thank all of our panelists, and I think in particular thank America Abroad Media because for the great work you do on airing these issues and doing it in an interesting way. Our panelists, I know, bring a great deal of expertise to the table. I hope that our discussion today has been enlightening for some of those that are following this issue. And I think we all hope that whatever the scope and extent of the legislation, that we'll see something that, at a very minimum, makes our immigration system here in the United States more efficient. And perhaps that we might aspire to do 2 things. One is to seize the opportunities that we're losing as a result of it, rather than just fixing the problems. Whether that be in the context of entrepreneurs or whether it be in the context of this extraordinary number of 600,000 students that come to the United States to study. But I think the other thing that was new to me that came out of this discussion was indeed, I think, the question that Tom Buick mentioned, which was, are we not thinking big enough in the United States? Should we be thinking about whether there is actually a U.S. role in providing global leadership in this area? I think the fact that we've struggled means that maybe we're not qualified to do this, but certainly it is. I think that's a great thought and a great idea to send us off thinking about how we might stretch our thinking and set our expectations in terms of how we can make the world work better in terms of the movement of people in the same way that we've worked hard to in the movement of services. So thank you very much indeed to all of our panelists, and thanks to all of our audience for joining us here today, and thanks to everybody who joined us via the internet.
Thank you.
Thank you. This is great.